Imagine walking through a cold, forgotten graveyard in 16th century Europe. The air is thick with damp earth, but as the gravediggers open a tomb, they don't find a peaceful skeleton. Instead, they find a corpse with a heavy stone shoved violently into its jaw. In another grave nearby, a sharp iron sickle is pinned across a woman's throat, guaranteed to decapitate her if she ever tries to sit up. These aren't crime scenes. These are desperate, terrified precautions. Centuries before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, before Hollywood gave us capes and fangs, our ancestors were fighting a very real, very physical war against the undead. This isn't a ghost story. This is the dark, historical truth of a global panic. Welcome to the disturbing true origin of vampires. When we think of vampires today, we picture elegant aristocrats in Gothic castles. We think of charm, seduction, and cinematic moonlight. But the true origins of the vampire are far from elegant. They are born from filth, disease, and an absolute, primal terror of the unknown. To find the real vampire, we have to dig in the dirt, literally. Literally, in the year 2006, archaeologists excavating a 16th century mass grave on the Venetian island of Nuovo Lazaretto uncovered something that sent chills down their spines. Among the remains of plague victims, they found the skull of a woman, but she wasn't laid to rest peacefully. A large, heavy brick had been intentionally and violently rammed into her mouth after she died. This was no accident. The force required to lodge the brick had broken her teeth and jaw. To the researchers, the message was clear. The people who buried her believed she was an eater of shrouds, a demon of the grave. They put the brick there to starve her, to stop her from chewing her way out of the earth and feasting on the blood of the living. The media quickly dubbed her the Vampire of Venice. But she wasn't an isolated case. Fast forward to a few years later in Drosko, a rural village in Poland. Archaeologists unearthed an entire cemetery filled with what experts call deviant burials. These were graves where the dead were, treated not with respect, but with absolute dread. They found a woman buried with a sharp iron sickle placed precisely across her throat. If the corpse bloated, or if the deceased attempted to rise from the dead, the blade would instantly slice her head off. In another grave nearby, a body was found padlocked to the earth by its big toe. Others were buried face down, so that if they tried to dig their way out, they would only dig themselves deeper into hell. Why? What could possess an entire community, farmers, priests, mothers, and fathers, to desecrate the bodies of their own neighbors? To understand this, you have to put yourself in the mind of a 16th century European. This was a world without germ theory. A world where a simple scratch could lead to a fatal infection, and where sudden, unexplained deaths were terrifyingly common. When a mysterious illness swept through a village, taking family members one by one, the panicked survivors desperately sought an explanation. Often, the blame fell on the first person to die. The villagers would return to the graveyard, shovels in hand, their hearts pounding in the dark. They would dig up the freshly buried corpse to look for signs of life, and what they found terrified them. In a time before embalming, the natural process of human decomposition is a gruesome, highly active spectacle. As internal organs break down, gases build up inside the torso, causing the corpse to bloat, making it look wet. The pressure forces a dark, reddish fluid known as purge fluid up through the windpipe and out of the mouth and nose. To an uneducated, terrified villager holding a trembling lantern, this didn't look like science. It looked like a corpse that had recently drank fresh blood. It looked like a monster. They believed the dead were returning to feed on the living. And so, the desecrations began. The stones, the sickles, the stakes through the heart. They were fighting a war against an enemy that couldn't fight back, entirely unaware that the real killer wasn't sleeping in the graves. It was floating in the very air they breathed. Imagine a village where the cold winds carry nothing but the smell of sickness. It's the 17th century, and a shadow has fallen over your home. First, your neighbor falls ill. He grows unnaturally pale, his energy slowly draining away day by day. He coughs violently, leaving drops of bright red blood on his handkerchief. He complains of a heavy weight on his chest, asifsomion, or something is sitting on him in the dead of night, sucking the very breath from his lungs. Within weeks, he is dead. But the nightmare doesn't end there. A few days after his funeral, his widow begins to show the exact same symptoms. Then, his eldest son. They're wasting away, their skin turning translucent, their eyes sunken into dark, hollow pits. They look exactly like people who are being slowly, methodically drained of their life force. Today, medical science has a name for this invisible killer. Tuberculosis, historically known as consumption. We know it spreads through airborne bacteria when an infected person coughs or sneezes. But to the desperate, terrified people of early modern Europe, microscopic pathogens did not exist. They didn't have microscopes. They had folklore. And when a family started dying off one by one, the logic was terrifyingly simple. The first person to die was coming back from the grave to drag their loved ones down into the dark. During the massive disease outbreaks that swept across Europe, including the Black Death, cholera, and consumption death was so sudden and overwhelming that people demanded an explanation. They needed a scapegoat. The graves were often shallow, hastily dug, just to keep up with the rising body count. And because of this, terrified gravediggers would sometimes hear horrifying noises coming from beneath the dirt. Groans, shifting earth, muffled chewing sounds. It wasn't the dead returning to life. It was biology. As we touched on before, the decomposition of a human body is a highly active process. But in the context of a plague, it became the ultimate proof of the supernatural. As bacteria multiplied inside a buried corpse, the massive buildup of internal gases would occasionally force air up through the decaying vocal cords, creating haunting, muffled groans that echoed out of the shallow plague pits. Worse still, this pressure forced a dark, blood-stained liquid known as purge fluid from the rotting lungs up into the mouth. This fluid would soak the linen burial shroud covering the corpse's face. Because the fluid was highly acidic, it would literally eat away at the fabric over the mouth. To anyone who dug up the grave, it looked exactly as though the corpse had desperately chewed through its own burial cloth in a ravenous hunger. When the panicked villagers inevitably exhumed the suspected vampire, the visual evidence seemed undeniable. They found a swollen, ruddy corpse. Its stomach distended as if it had just feasted. Blood stained its lips and chin. The nails and hair appeared to have grown, a gruesome optical illusion caused by the surrounding skin shrinking and pulling back. To them, the monster was absolutely real. And so, the violent rituals began. Staking, burning, decapitation, and stuffing the mouth with dirt or bricks. They weren't committing atrocities. They genuinely believed they were performing acts of salvation, protecting the rest of the town from a supernatural predator. But the ultimate, heartbreaking tragedy was that while the villagers were busy hacking apart rotting corpses, the real killer, the microscopic bacteria, was quietly spreading through the crowd gathered around the open grave. It was a vicious cycle of death and delusion. But while Western Europe was battling disease and shrewd-eaters, a much darker, much more intricate mythology was brewing further east. Beyond the mountains, in the dense, shadowy forests of Eastern Europe, the vampire wasn't just a byproduct of a plague. It was an ancient, deeply ingrained terror waiting in the dark. Far from the crowded, plague-ridden streets of Western Europe, a different kind of darkness was taking root. If you travel eastward, deep into the isolated villages of the Carpathian Mountains, the air grows colder. The forests become denser, and the folklore becomes far more ancient. In places like Romania, the terror of the walking dead wasn't just a temporary panic triggered by a sudden epidemic. It was a deeply ingrained, everyday reality. It was a fundamental law of nature. Here, the monster had a name that would echo through history. The word itself is ancient, derived from the Roman Strix, a mythological screech owl said to feast on human flesh and blood. But in Romanian folklore, the strigoi evolved into something far more complex and terrifying. Unlike the accidental vampires of the plague pits, becoming a strigoi was often seen as an inescapable dark curse written into a person's life from the very moment of their birth, or sealed by the tragic nature of their death. In these isolated communities, anything that disrupted the natural order was viewed with deep suspicion. You didn't just become a monster because you caught a disease. You became a monster because you were an outcast. If a child was born out of wedlock, or if they were the seventh child in a family, they were marked. The most terrifying omen of all was being born with a cholera medical event where the amniotic sac remains intact. Oberte baby S had like a translucent membrane. To the villagers, this wasn't a biological quirk, it was a veil of the undead. But the curse of the Strigoi was also tied to how a person lived and died. A life of profound sin, practicing dark magic, or dying by suicide almost guaranteed a horrifying resurrection. Even an unbaptized infant or someone who died before they could be married was considered at high risk of returning to the mortal realm. Romanian folklore was so intricate that it divided these creatures into two distinct categories. There were the Strigoi, living witches who could send their souls out at night to drain the vitality of their neighbors. And then there was the ultimate nightmare, the Strigoi Mort, the dead who refused to stay buried. When a Strigoi Mort rose from its grave, it didn't just seek blood. It was a walking curse. It would return to its own family first, knocking on the doors and windows in the dead of night, calling out the names of its loved ones. If someone answered, they were doomed to waste away. The Strigoi brought invisible devastation. It soured the milk of the cattle, brought localized droughts to the crops, and slowly drained the life force of the entire household. Only when the family was weakened would it finally resort to drinking their blood. The fear was so absolute that the rituals to stop a Strigoi were brutal and elaborate. Garlic, known for its strong, purifying properties, was placed in the mouth of the deceased. Iron nails were driven into the skull to pin the spirit down. If the villagers suspected a grave had been compromised, they would exhume the body. If they found the corpse blotted with the telltale purge fluid, they didn't just stake it. They would cut out the heart, burn it to ashes on an open pyre, mix the ashes with water, and force the sick family members to drink it as a morbid, desperate cure. This was the gruesome reality of the vampire myth in Eastern Europe. But as the fear of the undead spread, different cultures manifested their own terrifying variations of the monster. To the northwest, in the shadowed borders of Germany, another creature was waiting in the dirt, one that didn't even need to leave its grave to kill you. Deep in the folklore of northern Germany and the chilling mist-covered regions of Bavaria and Silesia, there exists a vampire that defies everything we think we know about the undead. This creature doesn't transform into a bat. It doesn't stalk the cobblestone streets at midnight looking for the necks of beautiful victims. In fact, this monster never even leaves its coffin. But it is just as deadly, and the psychological terror it inflicts is arguably far worse. They called it the Naxira, a name that roughly translates to the after-devourer. The Naxira was born out of the same plague-driven paranoia that created the Schroediters of Italy, but the German folklore twisted it into a nightmare of sympathetic magic. According to legend, a Naxira was created when a person died suddenly, by suicide or as the first victim of an epidemic. When the burial dirt settled, the horror began. Imagine waking up in pitch blackness. You are trapped in a wooden box beneath 6 feet of heavy soil. According to the myth, the Naxira awakens in its grave, consumed by a ravenous, unnatural hunger. Unable to dig its way out, the creature begins to feast on the only thing available, its own burial shroud. When the cloth is gone, it begins to consume its own flesh. But here is where the true horror lies. The Naxira doesn't just eat itself through a dark, mystical connection to its bloodline. Every bite the creature takes in the grave slowly drains the life force of its surviving family members above ground. As the monster chews in the dark, its widow, its children, or its siblings begin to mysteriously waste away. Tay grew pale, weak, and feverish, eventually following the creature into the grave one by one. The folklore explicitly stated that if you walked through a cemetery at night during an epidemic, you could hear them. Gravediggers reported hearing the muffled, wet sounds of violent chewing, or chilling grunts that sounded like pigs feeding in the dirt. To a grieving family watching their loved ones die of a mysterious disease, these graveyard sounds were absolute proof that an Naxira was eating them alive from below. To stop the curse, the villagers had to act with brutal efficiency. When they dug up the suspected grave, they looked for specific signs. The left eye of the corpse remaining stubbornly open, or the thumb of the corpse resting inside its mouth. If these signs were present, the solution was swift. They would place a heavy stone or a coin directly into the corpse's mouth to paralyze its jaws. Sometimes they would tie the jaw tightly shut with a cloth, or in extreme cases, drive a spike through the mouth, pinning the head to the bottom of the coffin. The Naxira is a perfect, terrifying example of how our ancestors used the supernatural to explain the relentless spread of infectious disease within a single household. But while the peasants of Europe were battling microscopic bacteria disguised as rotting corpses, history was about to produce a flesh-and-blood human being, whose real-life atrocities were so staggering, his name would eventually become the universal synonym for the vampire, a man who didn't drink blood, but who spilled oceans of it. The name Dracula conjures an immediate image. A charming, aristocratic immortal in a velvet cape, living in a crumbling castle, seducing his victims in the dead of night. But long before Bram Stoker wrote his famous novel in the name Dracula belonged to a very real, fiercely mortal warlord. He was a man whose cruelty was so profound and whose military tactics were so brutally psychological that history itself struggled to separate his reign from the realm of nightmares. His real name was Vlad III, Prince of Vlad, but history remembers him as Vlad the Imp. To understand Vlad, you have to understand the violent, unforgiving world of 15th century Eastern Europe. Wallachia, located in modern-day Romania, was a bloody buffer zone. It was caught directly between the expanding, massive Ottoman Empire to the south and the Christian Kingdom of Hungary to the north. It was a land of constant war, political betrayal, and shifting alliances. Vlad's father, Vlad II, had been inducted into a secretive, prestigious knightly order called the Order of the Dragon, created to defend Christian Europe. In the local language, dragon was translated as Dracula, because the dragon was also associated with the devil. The name carried a dark, double meaning. When Vlad III took the throne, he became Dracula, literally, the son of the dragon, or the son of the devil. Vlad's upbringing was steeped in trauma. As a young boy, he and his brother were handed over to the Ottoman Sultan as political hostages to ensure their father's loyalty. During his years in captivity, Vlad was educated in science, philosophy, and the brutal arts of war. He witnessed firsthand the ruthless tactics used to break enemies. When he finally returned to Wallachia to claim his throne, he found a fractured, lawless country run by treacherous noblemen who had assassinated his family. Vlad realized that to survive, he couldn't just defeat his enemies. He had to absolutely terrify them. He had to become a monster, and his chosen method of psychological warfare was a slow, agonizing execution designed for maximum visible horror. Victims were hoisted into the air and pierced with a massive, oiled wooden stake. The stake was carefully guided to avoid vital organs, ensuring the victim would suffer 4 days in the scorching sun before finally dying. Vlad didn't just use this on foreign invaders. He used it on thieves, corrupt merchants, and the treacherous nobles of his own court. He wanted total, unquestioning order. His defining moment of terror came in 1462. The powerful Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, marched a massive army into Wallachia to crush Vlad once and for all. As the Sultan's forces advanced toward the capital city of Targovist, they didn't find a defending army. Instead, they walked into a waking nightmare. Spread out before the city gates was the forest of the Impaler. Over 20,000 Ottoman prisoners of war and Wallachian traitors were hoisted in the air on wooden stakes, their decaying bodies swarming with crows. The stench was unbearable. The sight was so psychologically devastating that the Sultan, a man who had conquered Constantinople, was said to have stared in horror, turned his massive army around, and retreated. Vlad was eventually killed in battle, his head sent to the Sultan as proof of his death. He never drank blood. He never arose from the grave. To his people, he was a harsh but necessary national hero who protected his homeland. So how did this medieval warlord become the ultimate vampire? That connection wouldn't be made for another 400 years. But long before fiction merged with Vlad's history, another Eastern European noble was committing crimes so drenched in actual blood, she gave birth to the terrifying myth of immortal youth. High in the Carpathian Mountains, separated by decades and hundreds of miles from the brutal reign of Vlad the Impaler, lived a woman whose legacy is permanently stained crimson. While Vlad used terror and impalement as political tools of war, the horrors inside the sieged castle in the late 16th century were born from something far more intimate and terrifying: absolute vanity and a chilling obsession with eternal youth. Her name was Countess Elizabeth Bathory, and to history, she is known as the Blood Countess. She is the very real inspiration for the aristocratic, blood-drinking vampire. Born into one of the oldest, wealthiest, and most powerful noble families in Hungary, Elizabeth Bathory was a woman of immense privilege and, reportedly, striking beauty. But behind the fortified stone walls of her remote estate, rumors began to seep out into the surrounding villages. Dark, whispered tales of local peasant girls who were hired as servants, lured by the promise of good wages, only to vanish entirely. At first, no one dared question the countess. The Bathory family essentially owned the region. But as the years passed, the whispers turned into screams. The death toll grew too large to ignore. It wasn't just peasant girls anymore. Minor nobility who sent their daughters to the castle to learn courtly etiquette were never seeing them again. By 1610, the rumors of extreme torture and mass murder reached the ears of King Matthias II of Hungary. He ordered an immediate, unannounced raid on Szeged Castle, led by a powerful nobleman named Georgi. What Thurzo and his men found when they breached the castle gates at night was a scene ripped straight from the depths of hell. They discovered dead and dying girls scattered throughout the estate. Some were found hidden in the chambers, bearing horrific signs of prolonged unimaginable torture. The surviving servants confessed to a systematic, mechanical operation of sadism orchestrated by the countess herself. Needles under fingernails, freezing girls in the snow, and severe beatings were only the beginning. But it was the legend that grew from these atrocities that forever linked Elizabeth Bathory to the vampire myth. According to the folklore that exploded after her arrest, the countess believed that the blood of young, virginal women held the secret to immortality. The myth claimed that she would suspend her victims above a silver tub, slash their veins, and bathe in their warm blood, convinced it would smooth her wrinkles and preserve her fading beauty. Whether she actually bathed in blood is heavily debated by modern historians, who suggest the blood-bathing myth was added years later to sensationalize the crimes. But the fact remains, Elizabeth Bathory was undoubtedly one of history's most prolific serial killers. Her political power spared her from execution. Instead, she was dragged into a windowless room inside her own castle. Masons were brought in to brick up the doorway, leaving only a tiny slit for air and plates of food. She lived the rest of her life trapped in the dark, walled alive with the ghosts of her victims, until she died 4 years later. The terrifying concept of an elite, wealthy predator draining the life force of the lower class for personal immortality had been planted. But while Bathory was rotting in her walls, the fear of the undead was about to explode into a continent-wide frenzy, a panic so severe that it would force governments to step in. As the 18th century dawned, Western Europe was entering the age of enlightenment. It was an era defined by reason, science, and a fierce rejection of medieval superstition. Philosophers debated logic in Parisian salons, and medical science was slowly beginning to map the human body. But just beyond the borders of this modern, rational world, an absolute, terrifying hysteria was brewing. While the West looked to the future, Eastern Europe was dragging something monstrous out of the dirt. Welcome to the Great Vampire Epidemic. Between the 1720s and 1730s, a massive, unprecedented panic swept through the rural villages of Serbia, Hungary, and Wallachia. It wasn't just isolated incidents of terrified peasants digging up their dead. This was a full-scale, contagion-like hysteria that paralyzed entire regions. People were abandoning their homes. Graveyards were being systematically The stench of burning corpses filled the valleys as villagers desperately sought to destroy the demons they believed were stalking them in the night. What made this epidemic different from the plague panics of the past was politics. Following a series of wars with the Ottoman Empire, the powerful Habsburg monarchy of Austria expanded its borders eastward, absorbing these remote, deeply superstitious territories. Suddenly, disciplined Austrian military officers, doctors, and government officials were stationed in these isolated villages to enforce order. When the local peasants began demanding permission to dig up their dead, the Austrian officials were initially baffled. They viewed the locals as uneducated and deeply superstitious. But to keep the peace and prevent a full-blown violent uprising, the military agreed to supervise They sent trained military surgeons to observe the digging, take meticulous notes, and document the findings. The rational, enlightened minds of the Austrian Empire expected to find nothing but rotting bones and dirt. Instead, they stood at the edge of the open graves, horrified by what they witnessed. They saw corpses that had been buried for weeks or even months, yet showed almost zero signs of normal decay. The bodies were plumped, their skins stretched tight and displaying a healthy, reddish hue. Fresh, liquid blood was pooled in their mouths and seeping from their ears. When the executioners drove wooden stakes through the chests of the dead, the military officials documented, with their own eyes and on official government parchment, that the corpses let out audible groans. Thick, fresh blood geysered from the wounds, soaking the earth. To the Austrian doctors, this defied all logic and medical science known at the time. They didn't understand the complex, varied stages of human decomposition in different soil types and temperatures. They didn't know about purge fluid or the vocal sounds caused by escaping gases. What they saw looked exactly like what the peasants claimed it was, a creature that had been drinking the blood of the living. For the first time in history, the vampire was no longer just a peasant folktale whispered around a fire. It was a documented, officially reported phenomenon, verified by government officials and military doctors. These sensational, chilling reports were sealed with official state stamps, sent back to the capital in Vienna, and eventually leaked to the press. The documents spread like wildfire across Europe. Newspapers translated the reports into German, French, and English. The word vampire finally entered the global vocabulary, sparking a sensation that terrified and fascinated the public. The age of reason had accidentally validated a monster, and at the very center of this storm were two specific, highly documented cases that would change history forever. In the dusty archives of Vienna, there are documents that read like Gothic horror fiction, yet they bear the official seals of the Austrian Empire. During the height of the great vampire epidemic in the early 18th century, two specific cases became the ultimate proof of the undead. They were investigated not by superstitious peasants, but by pragmatic, disciplined military officers. Their reports shocked the educated world and officially introduced the word vampire to the global vocabulary. The first case occurred in 1725 in the rural Serbian village of Kisil. A peasant named Peter Plagojewicz passed away and was buried without incident. But less than a week later, a sudden string of deaths terrorized the village. 9 people died within 8 days. The local Austrian official, Imperial Provisor Frombald, initially refused, but the peasants threatened to abandon the village entirely and leave the region destitute if he didn't comply. Reluctantly, Frombald attended the exhumation, accompanied by a local priest. In his official report, sent back to Vienna, Frombald's tone shifted from bureaucratic annoyance to absolute horror. He documented that Peter's body, which had been buried for over a month, showed almost no signs of decay. The skin had sloughed off, revealing fresh, new skin underneath. His hair, beard, and nails appeared to have grown. But the detail that terrified the official the most was the fresh, liquid blood pooling in the corpse's mouth. When the villagers drove a stake through Peter's heart, Frombald officially recorded that fresh blood rushed from the wound, the ears, and the nose. If the Plagojewicz case started the fire, the case of Arnold Pale poured gasoline on it. A few years later, in the Serbian village of Madugia, an ex-militiaman named Arnold Pale broke his neck, falling from a hay wagon. While alive, Pale had often told a dark story of being attacked by a vampire years earlier in Greece. He claimed he had cured himself by eating earth from the vampiress grave and smearing himself with its blood. But his preventative measures failed in death. Weeks after his fatal fall, 4 people complained that Pale had attacked them in the night. Soon after, they all died. This time, the Austrian military sent a high-ranking infectious disease specialist, Regimental Medical Officer Johannes Flückinger, to investigate. Flückinger supervised the digging up of the graveyard and published his findings in a famous report titled Visum et Orsine and Discovered. The report detailed the exhumation of over 40 graves. It clinically described corpses that were gorged with blood, their organs entirely fresh. When they staked Pale, Flückinger documented that the corpse let out an audible, terrifying shriek before blood burst from its chest. Flückinger's report was translated and printed in newspapers across London, Paris, and Berlin. It became a viral sensation. If trained military surgeons were certifying that the dead were drinking blood, how could anyone deny it? The panic reached such a fever pitch that the highest powers in Europe realized they had to step in, or the hysteria would tear their empires apart. By the mid-1700s, Europe was split in two. In the rural East, people were systematically destroying their graveyards in a desperate war against the undead. In the sophisticated cities of the West, the intellectual elite were obsessed with the viral military reports coming out of Serbia. The phenomenon became the ultimate debate of the Enlightenment. Could a rational, modern world coexist with blood-drinking corpses? The debate reached its peak with a highly respected French Benedictine monk and biblical scholar named Dame Augustine. In 1746, Calmet published a massive, highly detailed treatise analyzing the vampire reports. He gathered every piece of evidence, every military document, and every eyewitness account. He cross-referenced them with theology and history. Calmet wasn't a fanatic. He genuinely wanted to know if these creatures were the work of demons, magic, or simply a natural phenomenon that science hadn't explained yet. Because Calmet took the subject seriously, his book became an international bestseller. But it accidentally had the opposite effect. Instead of calming the public, his rigorous documentation validated the terror. The hysteria worsened. Villages were burning their dead so frequently that the smoke was becoming a nuisance. Finally, the Empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Maria Theresa, decided she had seen enough. She was an enlightened monarch, completely exhausted by the chaos and the embarrassment these superstitious panics were causing her empire. She needed to end the vampire epidemic permanently. To do this, she didn't send an army. She sent a doctor. Gerard van Swieten was the Empress's personal physician and one of the brightest scientific minds of his era. He was dispatched to the eastern provinces with a singular mission: investigate the vampire claims and find the biological truth. Van Swieten approached the exhumations completely devoid of fear. Where military men saw monsters, he saw biology. In his subsequent report, which effectively killed the vampire panic, he broke down the science of decomposition. He explained that a lack of oxygen in deep graves, combined with cold temperatures and certain types of soil, naturally preserved bodies far longer than expected. He clinically explained that the fresh blood was simply the breakdown of red blood cells, liquefying and being forced up by internal gases. The screams heard when a stake pierced a lung were just trapped air escaping through the windpipe. He concluded, with absolute scientific authority, that vampires did not exist. The entire phenomenon was the result of ignorance, grief, and a complete misunderstanding of what happens to the human body after death. Armed with Van Switten's undeniable medical proof, Empress Maria Theresa took swift, decisive action. She passed strict imperial laws that completely outlawed the opening of graves and the desecration of bodies. Anyone caught staking or burning a corpse would be severely punished by the state. By the stroke of a royal pen, the great vampire epidemic was extinguished. The government had finally put the monster back in the ground. But while science had won the battle in the dirt, the vampire was far from dead. It was simply evolving. Stripped of its rotting flesh and grave dirt, the vampire was about to be reborn in the drawing rooms of high society. The monster was about to learn how to read, write, and seduce. By the late 19th century, the world was rapidly modernizing. Railroads crisscrossed the American landscape. Telegraph lines connected distant cities, and electric lights were beginning to push back the darkness. The brutal, superstitious vampire panics of Eastern Europe seemed like ancient history, safely buried in the past. But in the quiet, isolated farming communities of New England, a terrifying echo of that old-world hysteria was about to resurface, and it would result in one of the most thoroughly documented, chilling cases of vampirism in American history. This was the New England vampire panic, and at its center was a young woman named Mercy Brown. In the late 1800s, Rhode Island was being ravaged by an invisible killer. It wasn't called a plague or a curse. It was called consumption. Today, we know it as tuberculosis. It was the leading cause of death in the United States, and it swept through families with a slow, agonizing cruelty. Victims would literally waste away, coughing up blood, their skin turning pale and translucent. Because germ theory was still in its infancy and not widely accepted in rural areas, desperate farmers fell back on an ancient, horrifying logic. The dead were feeding on the living. In the town of Exeter, George Brown was watching his family disappear. His wife, Mary, was the first to die of consumption in 1883. 6 months later, his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, followed her into the grave. Several years passed, and then the illness struck his son, Edwin, a strong young man who had moved away but returned home desperately sick. Shortly after Edwin's return, George's 19-year-old daughter, Mercy, contracted the disease. She deteriorated rapidly and died in January 89 too. As Edwin's condition worsened, panic spread through the community. The neighbors convinced a grieving George Brown that the only explanation for the family's relentless tragedy was that one of the deceased women was a vampire, secretly draining Edwin's life force from the grave. To save his son, George had to do the unthinkable. He had to dig up his wife and daughters. On a freezing morning in March 1892, accompanied by a local doctor and a group of grim-faced townsfolk, George Brown entered the Chestnut Hill Cemetery. The ground was frozen solid. They exhumed the bodies of his wife and eldest daughter first. Both were completely skeletonized, exactly as they should be. But when they opened the crypt holding Mercy Brown, the men stepped back in absolute horror. Mercy had been dead for 2 months, but her body was perfectly preserved. Her skin was plump, and she had shifted in her coffin when the doctor, entirely baffled by the lack of decomposition, made an incision into her chest and removed her heart. He found it heavy, with fresh, liquid blood. To the terrified onlookers, this was absolute proof. Mercy was the monster. Science, of course, had a perfectly logical explanation. Mercy had been buried in the dead of a New England winter. The freezing temperatures of the crypt had acted like a refrigerator, naturally preserving her body and preventing the blood from coagulating. But the townsfolk didn't care about science. They cared about survival. Right there in the cemetery, they built a bonfire. They burned Mercy Brown's heart and liver to ashes. In a desperate, macabre ritual identical to those performed centuries earlier in Romania, they mixed the ashes with water and fed the murky concoction to Edwin, hoping the remains of the vampire would cure him. It didn't work. Edwin died 2 months later. The Mercy Brown case made national headlines, shocking the modern American public with its grim medieval brutality. It was the last gasp of the historical vampire. But while the flesh and blood monsters were finally being laid to rest, a completely different kind of vampire was about to be born, not in a graveyard, but in a European mansion. If the true historical vampire was a bloated, rotting peasant with dirt under its nails, how did we end up with the elegant, sophisticated, velvet-clad aristocrats we know today? How did a creature born of disease and graveyard soil transform into a romantic icon of high society? To find the answer, we have to leave the rural villages of Eastern Europe and travel to a luxurious mansion by Lake Geneva, Switzerland, in the year 1816. It was known as the year without a summer. A massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia had cast an ash cloud across the globe, plunging Europe into months of relentless rain, darkness, and freezing temperatures, trapped indoors by the apocalyptic weather. A group of brilliant, eccentric, and highly scandalous British writers rented the Villa Diodati to pass the time. Among them was the infamous poet Lord Byron, the young poet Percy Shelley, Percy's soon-to-be wife Mary Godwin, and Byron's personal physician, a young man named John William Polite. To entertain themselves on a particularly stormy night, Lord Byron proposed a contest. They would each write a ghost story to see who could invoke the most terror. That single, rainy night changed the landscape of horror forever. Mary Godwin, who would soon become Mary Shelley, conceived the idea for a scientist who reanimates a corpse, giving birth to Frankenstein. But Lord Byron also started a story. He wrote a brief, fragmented tale about an aristocratic bloodsucker, but quickly grew bored and abandoned it. John William Polidori, however, saw the brilliance in the concept. Polidori took Byron's discarded fragment and expanded it into a short story titled simply The Vampire. When Polidori published the story in 1819, he did something revolutionary. He completely discarded the folklore of the plague-ridden, mindless shrine. Instead, he modeled his vampire on Lord Byron himself. Polidori's monster was named Lord Root. He wasn't a peasant. He was a wealthy, charismatic nobleman. He didn't hide in a grave. He attended high society balls in London and traveled the world. He was mysterious, coldly arrogant, deeply seductive, and incredibly dangerous. Lord Ruthven preyed not on his own family, but on the beautiful, innocent young women of the upper class, destroying their lives and their reputations before draining their blood. The Vampire was an explosive success. It shocked and fascinated Victorian society. Readers were terrified by the idea that a monster didn't have to look like a rotting corpse. It could look like a perfect gentleman. It could be invited into your home. The psychological terror shifted from the fear of disease to the fear of the predatory elite. Polidori single-handedly invented the modern vampire archetype. Without Lord Ruthven, there would be no Carmilla, the haunting tale of a female vampire published 50 years later. And without Carmilla, there would absolutely be no Dracula. When an Irish theatre manager named Bram Stoker finally published his masterpiece in 1897, he took the aristocratic blueprint Polidori created, combined it with the dark history of Vlad the Impaler, and cemented the vampire's image for all of eternity. We have traveled from the muddy, plague-ridden mass graves of 16th century Venice to the freezing crypts of rural New England. We have seen the horrific realities of the deviant burials, the tragic hysteria of tuberculosis, and the genuine blood-soaked brutality of historical warlords and countesses. We watched as science desperately tried to extinguish the panic, only for literature to resurrect the monster, washing away the graveyard dirt and dressing it in a tailored velvet suit. Today, the vampire is absolutely everywhere. When Bela Lugosi donned the black cape in the 1931 classic film adaptation of Dracula, he cemented a suave, hypnotic image that forever erased the grotesque reality of the folklore. Hollywood took the aristocratic blueprint created by John Polidori and Bram Stoker and mass-produced it for a global audience. The vampire evolved from a symbol of disease into a symbol of seduction. We have tragic anti-heroes, glittering heartthrobs, and brooding immortals. We no longer fear the undead. We romanticize them. We dress up as them for Halloween and invite them into our living rooms through our television screens. The creature that once caused entire empires to pass emergency laws has become a harmless, highly profitable staple of pop culture. But in our endless obsession with the fictional Count Dracula, we have committed a profound act of historical amnesia. We have forgotten the real victims of the vampire myth. The true story of the vampire is not a story of supernatural monsters. It is a story of profound human tragedy. It is the story of a mother in medieval Poland, buried with an iron sickle pinned across her throat by neighbors who were absolutely terrified she would return. It is the story of panic-stricken peasants in Serbia, watching their families waste away from an invisible, microscopic killer they couldn't possibly comprehend. It is the heartbreaking reality of George Brown, a desperate father in Rhode Island who felt forced by his community to carve the heart out of his own 19-year-old daughter just to save his dying son. The real vampires were never the rotting corpses resting beneath the dirt. The real monster was the absolute, paralyzing terror of the unknown. It was the darkness of a world before modern medicine, where sudden death was a daily reality, and where unimaginable grief could twist the human mind into committing unspeakable acts of desecration against the people they once loved. Our ancestors weren't fighting demons. They were fighting their own desperate, primal fear of mortality. We have conquered the plagues that birthed the We understand the biology of decomposition that terrified the Austrian military. We have turned on the lights, and the monsters have safely retreated into the shadows of fiction. But the next time you walk past a quiet, ancient graveyard, or when you feel the cold wind rattle your windows on a pitch-black night, remember the dark history buried in the earth beneath your feet. The vampires of our ancestors were entirely real to them, and their fear was just as contagious and just as deadly as any disease. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the disturbing true history of the vampire. If you enjoyed uncovering the dark origins of this legend, please hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss an episode. We are dedicated to uncovering the historical truths, forgotten mysteries, and terrifying realities that shaped our modern world. Now, I want to turn it over to you. Drop a comment below and let me know which mythological creature, historical mystery, or dark legend we should investigate next. Should we look into the true history of werewolves, witches? Let me know your thoughts. Until next time, Remember that the scariest stories are always the ones that actually happen. Stay curious and keep questioning the past.